In my last video, I discussed the minuet. In this follow-up video, I will be discussing the scherzo. Seeing as the scherzo is similar in form to the structure of the minuet, I highly recommend you watch my video on the minuet first, as this video builds off topics I introduced there. While at a surface level, I've often heard the scherzo hurriedly described as a quick minuet, there's a bit more to it than that. First of all, it's important to take into account that the scherzo did not initially start out as a relative of the minuet, but rather as its own thing. The origin of the word scherzo is thankfully not a linguistic mystery like the title of some other dances, and is simply the Italian word for joke or jest, which comes from the German word Scherz, which means basically the same thing. In the Renaissance and early Baroque period, the title scherzo, or the plural scherzi, were applied to many differing works to evoke the mood rather than the form of a piece. From this, we can roughly deduce that any piece of that era titled or subtitled scherzo to have been of a light-hearted or joking nature. The scherzo, unlike many Renaissance or Baroque forms, does not originate from a courtly dance, but is purely a musical invention. Monteverdi, often seen as a linchpin composer between the Renaissance and Baroque periods, wrote scherzi often set to poetic verses. While there was at that time in Italy poets writing poems titled scherzi, these were rarely, if ever, adapted to the identically titled musical scherzi, as they were rarer than the musical scherzi of the period. However, it appears the earliest origins of the scherzo go along with developments in poetry rather than those in dance, as was the case with the rondo. Even at this early stage, the scherzo wasn't always strictly interpreted as a musical joke, with scherzi at times being written in a more serious nature. This begins a long tradition of the terminology of the scherzo or joke being often applied to works that have little to no humor to them. By the late Baroque period, composers like Bach would begin labeling movements to suites or partitas as scherzos, these typically being in a quick tempo and in a duple meter. Take the scherzo from Bach's keyboard partita in A minor as an example. While I wouldn't necessarily say this piece gives off the vibe of being a musical joke, it is still lighthearted in nature, and serves as a fresh interlude between the other movements and sets up the quick and more serious jig that follows. So while the scherzo was a term applied to works in the Baroque period, it was still fairly rare. It wouldn't be until the end of the 18th century that this would begin to change. Towards the end of the classical period, I would suggest that a problem had begun to plague how composers could innovate upon the multi-movement framework of symphonies and sonatas. This being the somewhat obligatory minuet and trio form movement, appearing either as the second or third movement in a four-movement work. While the other common forms used in multi-movement works, such as large ternary, sonata, and rondo form, offered a composer like Haydn and Beethoven ample room to explore and innovate, the minuet and trio form was becoming perhaps too rigid in its determining factors to experiment as much with as, say, the other common forms were. The first true evidence of this shift away from the minuet comes in Haydn's Opus 33 string quartets. In each quartet, Haydn opts to replace the minuet with movements titled either scherzo or scherzando. While at times quicker than the typical minuet of the period, they are structurally almost identical to the minuet, a precedent that would become the standard for all future scherzi. The difference here being in more aggressive textures, petulant repeating phrases, and startling dynamic juxtapositions. This method of composing being perhaps a hallmark of Haydn, who often relished in subverting audiences' expectations, or dare I say, outright surprising them. While at face value these minuet-like movements titled as scherzos or jokes can be viewed as not possessing anything of a joke-like quality at all, Haydn still labeled them as such. Musicologists often scratch their heads as to why Haydn made this choice. While I don't have any evidence to back this up, I'll submit my own personal theory, take it or leave it. But to me it's apparent that these scherzo or scherzando movements are full of extremes, and at times are incoherent in how they are structured compared to the dignified and disciplined structure of many of Haydn's other minuets. And while they may not come off to our modern ears as movements of a joke-like quality, it could have very well been received somewhat humorously in the 18th century. The idea of a quick, petulant, and almost choleric minuet is kind of a joke in and of itself. as it would be the opposite of what an audience of that era would have expected from a minuet, which these movements were replacing. What Haydn did in these quartets would go on to influence one of his pupils, this being Beethoven, who used the scherzo much more often and expanded it into a more serious and developed work in his symphonies and sonatas. So by the time we get to Beethoven in music history, it's important for us to go a bit into more depth as to what defines the scherzo as we know it now, and what makes it profoundly different to a minuet, because Beethoven more or less standardized what a scherzo could be going forward. The form of a scherzo is more or less the same as the minuet and trio form. For more information on this, refer to my video on the minuet. Even the trio sections of scherzos that contain them, which is more often than not, often adopts the calmer characteristic found in the trios of minuets. However, an important distinction needs to be made. Scherzos are much quicker in tempo than minuets, so while a scherzo often appears in the same 3/4 time as the minuet, it is generally not counted or felt in the same way as a minuet. Whereas a minuet has 3 countable pulses per measure, the 3/4 time of a scherzo moves at such a pace as to only realistically be counted as 1 pulse per measure. This quickness in tempo also forces a composer to dispense with the rigid 4 or 8 bar phrases common in the minuet, as its speed creates the necessity of writing far more measures of music than one would need to with a minuet. It is also worth mentioning that classical or romantic scherzos don't have to be in 3/4 time, as many also appear in 3/8 time, or even in 2/4 time, such as in this scherzo from Beethoven's 18th Piano Sonata. I would even go out on a limb and state that a scherzo could theoretically appear in any time signature, as long as it keeps the somewhat quick tempo and contrasting trio section intact. So as per the form of the scherzo, there is also some wiggle room established by Beethoven and later composers. Sometimes the trio section, for example, is dropped altogether, or repeated after being interjected by the initial theme, such as in the scherzo of Beethoven's 7th Symphony. What Beethoven ultimately developed the scherzo into was a movement that not only replaced the minuet, but also enabled more experimentation, something composers were perhaps no longer capable of achieving with the minuet. By the time Beethoven wrote the scherzo to his 9th Symphony, I think it's fair to state that the idea of this form being some type of joke completely vanished. When we get to the scherzi of composers like Chopin or Bruckner, the joke was more or less replaced by virtuosity, drama, and seriousness. However, this does not mean that these scherzi did not contain light-hearted moments, but rather they began to encompass far more emotion than merely humor. So where does this leave us? How do we define this form if it has several iterations, none of which are truly set in stone? Is it a minuet on stimulants, or is it more? It's quite obviously more than just a souped-up minuet, and a composer has to take into account the myriad of thematic forms a scherzo can take when structuring a multi-movement work that contains one or a standalone scherzo. Besides perhaps the defining characteristic of scherzi being quick, is that the scherzo also enables a composer any mood they desire to impart on it, so long as this is translatable to a quick tempo. It can be light-hearted, poke fun, be angry or petulant, dramatic and powerful, serious, nervous, or even grotesque, as was the case with Mahler or Shostakovich. It can also be many of those things at once. This type of dynamism is something you just can't really achieve with a minuet. As the multi-movement symphony or sonata evolved into far grander and dramatic pieces, the scherzo was simply more useful in its robust, chameleon-like characteristic. It's just better at creating a more fulfilling symphonic journey. But it still remains that as dramatic or epic a form the scherzo became, it still refers to itself as a joke. But there might be a way to remedy this. How does one get around this troubling terminology? How do you write something angry, violent, grotesque, serious, or powerful, and then basically call it a joke? One way of remedying this is not to focus on scherzo meaning joke at all, and just write whatever suits the form, or another way might be somewhat romantic in its interpretation. To sidetrack somewhat, great playwrights will often find the comedy in tragedy or the tragedy in comedy, and so too can a composer. Even if at a surface level, a scherzo you study or listen to might seem dramatic or serious at face value, you might at closer inspection often find something in that very piece, no matter how fleeting it might be, which manifests as an unprepared or unwarranted juxtaposition, or dare I say, an absurdity to the other musical material surrounding it. While it might not be laugh-out-loud funny, it might present itself as a cynical opposite to the general tone of the piece.
A few moments later.
So while no, a scherzo does not have to be of a purely whimsical quality, it's important to keep in mind that the power of a scherzo lies in its startling juxtapositions. It's crucial, in my opinion, as a composer to consider these things when writing a scherzo, and it's a considerable challenge when tackling this form in particular. This is why the Minuet ultimately disappeared, because it can't serve these type of nuanced artistic decisions, especially when music entered the Romantic period where tone poetry and programmatic music were all the rage. So I hope this video offered you a different perspective on the scherzo. The reason I focused on what a scherzo should say or be more than its form and structure is because it's constructed at a superficial level, much like a minuet, the rules for which I already discussed in my last video. Nonetheless, I think I've laid out why, although the scherzo can be written like a quick minuet, it can be so much more.